In this lesson, we're going to be talking about how all living things are classified or grouped. We're going to learn about all these different branches of life. This one is mainly, or I guess it has all the plants and animals in this big tree of life. We're going to be learning about how we group those living things and how they're named and things like that. These notes go on page 19. Now, a question might come up, why do we classify things? And you're probably familiar with some classification systems. It's a way of organizing information or items. In biology, we classify to make sense of how much life there is on the planet. There's millions of species, and we have to make sense of it all. But you're familiar with classification. I know the ladies are familiar with classification of shoes. We have different types of shoes, and of course they're worn in different occasions. We have flats, and we have pumps, and different kinds of shoes. We name them different things. This one's called a mule. This is a wedge, and we name them different things so we know what we're talking about. For you ladies, you probably are familiar with these types of shoes. The gentlemen maybe not so much, but what that does is helps us to communicate about the shoes and to say, hey, wear pumps tonight or something like that. We know what we're talking about. And the same thing for biology. We have to be able to make sense of all these different types of life and be able to know what we're talking about. Now, the system we used for classification in biology was developed in the 18th century by the scientist Carolus Linnaeus. His original name was Carl von Linné, and then he changed his name, but he was Swedish, and he came up with the system that we still use today. To develop his system, he used common characteristics to group organisms. So he looked at their characteristics and he grouped them based on what he could see. The other special thing about his system was that he gave every living thing a unique scientific name. Now, the question might be, what does that matter? Well, for instance, we have common names for organisms, a variety of common names, but sometimes the common names can be confusing. For instance, this insect, well, is it an insect? That's the question. This organism has many different names. You may have heard it called a sow bug or a pill bug, or when I was little, we called it a roly-poly, and I've even heard it called a potato bug. So depending on where you live and what you learned growing up, you might call this organism by different names. So it can be confusing if you're talking about it. Best thing to do then is to come up with a single name, and that's a scientific name, and Linnaeus gave us that. Here's another example. This organism is called Felis concolor, and the common name, there are many. We call it a mountain lion, we call it a cougar, we call it a puma, we call it a panther, we call it sometimes a ghost cat. So we're all talking about the same animal, but it has all these different names. Very important then that we use the scientific name, Felis concolor, so we know that we're talking about the same animal. So a single species may have more than one common name. Also, common names can be misleading. For instance, this we call a starfish, it's not a fish. This we call a silverfish, and it's a bug, it's not a fish at all. And this we call a seahorse, but it's not a horse, it's a fish. So it can be very confusing using common names. Having a unique scientific name solves all of these problems. So Linnaeus' system has 7 levels to it, and it's used again to group or classify each living thing. As you proceed up in levels, you get to smaller and smaller groups and more closely related organisms. For instance, if we just look at us, human beings, Homo sapiens, we are animals, we are chordates, animals with a backbone, we are mammals, we are primates, we are hominids, we are Homo, and we are Homo sapiens. So this is our entire classification, and it's how we are grouped along with all other animals. So if we look at, for instance, the kingdom we call Animalia, all animals, it would include things like jellyfish and insects, bears, bats, sharks, spiders. All of these organisms are all part of the kingdom of animals. If we then look at a smaller grouping, the phylum chordates, these are all of them that have a backbone. So we've now eliminated the insects and the jellyfish and things like that, and the worms, and now we just have these animals that have a backbone. Now if we group them even smaller, class Mammalia, now we've eliminated all the animals that are not mammals. It's a smaller grouping. So this includes just the organisms that have fur and that nurse their young on milk. That's mammals. Now, if we group them even into a smaller grouping, more closely related species, we can group them into the order Carnivora. These are the carnivores. And this grouping will include skunks and bears, and then these 4 organisms that kind of look like dogs a little bit. That's order Carnivora. And then we can go to even smaller grouping. Notice each time we go to a smaller grouping, we have fewer organisms that are grouped that way. Here's your family Canidae, which includes all of your canines. We have a fox, a coyote, a dog, and a wolf. And now we can even group further. The genus called Canis, now we've eliminated the fox and the coyote, and we're only including the wolf and the dog. And then our last grouping is the wolf. Canis lupus lupus is the scientific name of the wolf. So now we've gone from all animals, narrowed it all the way down to just this species, the wolf. Now the scientific name each organism receives is its genus and species name together. We call this binomial nomenclature. That just means two-name way of naming organisms, and Linnaeus gave us this. Knowing the scientific name, again, tells you what exact organism you're talking about and what other organisms it is most closely related to. So it's very important. Here's another example. This is an example of the honeybee. The honeybee is Apis mellifera. Here it is, little honeybee. It's in the kingdom of animals. Phylum Arthropoda. Class Insecta. The order name is Hymenoptera. It shares that name with ants and wasps. Then we have the family Apidae, which is bees, the genus Apis, and the species Mellifera. So here's the scientific name, Apis mellifera, right here, the genus and species together. Now, since the time of Linnaeus, we have kind of changed his classification system a little bit. We now have what we call 3 domains and 6 kingdoms instead of just a few, which is what Linnaeus came up with. Classification now is based on the number of cells and the type of cells, how the cells get energy, whether the organisms can move around, and of course DNA is important today. The first domain is the ARCHAEBACTERIA. These are ancient bacteria. They are prokaryotic cells. They are autotrophs, meaning that they get energy from the sun or from some other place. These are the ancient bacteria, the first cells they think to have evolved on the planet. The next domain are the EUBACTERIA. These are common bacteria. They are prokaryotic, meaning, of course, they have those simple cells. They can be parasites and get inside you and make you sick. They can be autotrophs, where they get their own energy. Or they could be saprobes. Saprobes are organisms that eat dead stuff, decomposers. So that's our domain, EUBACTERIA. These are the common bacteria. And then we have the third domain, Eukarya. Within Eukarya, there are 4 kingdoms that we're going to talk about. Kingdom fungi. These are yeasts, fungus of various types, mushrooms, and these are molds. Fungus can be unicellular, like yeast, or multicellular, like the mushrooms and the molds. They are saprobes, meaning they're decomposers. They break things down. And they are non-motile. Non-motile means they cannot get up and move from place to place. They're rooted to the ground. The second kingdom in Eukarya is the kingdom plants. These are autotrophs. They are non-motile, they're rooted to the ground, and they are multicellular. And you're probably familiar with plants. You see them every day. The third kingdom in domain Eukarya is Animalia, and I'm sure you're familiar with animals. These are heterotrophs. That means that they have to eat. They have to get their food from somewhere eating. They are motile, which means they can move around from place to place as they choose. And they are multicellular. And the final kingdom in the domain Eukarya is the kingdom Protista. This is a category I like to call the garbage category, so they just throw everything in here that doesn't fit somewhere else. It's a bunch of misfits. These are, again, eukaryotic cells, like the other members of domain Eukarya. They have a nucleus in the cell, but they can be unicellular or multicellular. They can be heterotrophs or autotrophs. They are very, very diverse. They include amoeba, These are diatoms, this is algae, and these are some other little microscopic organisms that live in the ocean. So if we look at an overview, we have our earliest organisms on the planet. We have this domain Archaea or ARCHAEBACTERIA. We have a domain of bacteria, and then we have our eukaryotic cells that make up the domain Eukarya, including 4 different kingdoms: animals, plants, fungus, and protists. And here's another way of looking at it. We have our bacterial groups, our ARCHAEBACTERIal groups, and then here are the eukaryotes, including animals, fungus, plants, and then these groups are our protists. So that's it for this lesson. Remember, these notes go on page 19, and we will see you later.